Oh yeah, says my proper name.
You Zops.
Oh yeah.
The Zops
Exops.
is back.
Yeah. That's Shane and I's little Canadian consulting company. Yeah. So as Bob mentioned, my name's Zachary Belford. You can call me either or. Talk title is Open Source Immortal. I work at ETC Labs Core. I work on a number of open source projects. Most notably, probably OpenRPC, Jade frame suite, and the Ethereum JSON RPC spec, which uses OpenRPC to define the base layer methods of Ethereum's JSON RPC methods. Okay, so I want to, well, first, how many of you maintain open source projects? Just hands up if you do. So a fair number of you. Some of you won't have to imagine too hard. But just assume the following. So you've done something that other people might find useful. And of course, this is tailored to software, but it's pretty generic. Like, it can be anything that people find useful. And it just so happens that people start using it. You put it on the internet, GitHub, wherever, SourceForge. Yeah, luckily, people find it useful, they pick it up, they start using it. And so now you are an open source developer, and that's the first image on Google with a person in it for open source developers. So you're one of those guys now. So I want to just sort of pause there. You have like users on this project that you started that you find useful, they find useful, and there's a lot of things that can happen from there. So one scenario is you decide to make a change to your project, and that change breaks everybody else's code. In your opinion, obviously, that change is for the better. In other people's opinion, maybe not. So let's say the group of people that are using your project take your project and they fork it and they continue on without you. And so the question I sort of ask is that a failure of the project? And I would say that I almost guarantee there would be more than one answer to that question in this room. So another scenario, similarly, would be somebody else that is using your project comes around and proposes a change that is fundamentally breaking and would force you to update your software and possibly the other contributors. And in your opinion, it's not a worthwhile change, and so you reject it. Same thing, those group of people go fork it. Is that a failure? And I wish I had a good answer, but it's really unclear because it's based on the goals of your project to begin with. And so that brings you to well, what is the goal of an open source project? Why even bother taking code and making it open source? Well, most of the time, I would say in all of the sustainable cases of open source software, the primary goal is to just improve the quality of the code. So quality being less unintended effects of the code, but more often than not just better documentation, easier for people to get started with it, and that kind of thing, right? And that, in contrast to a business who would develop software, really the only goal of software in a business is to earn more revenue. And so why would a business then open source a project? There's really only one reason that to me makes sense is if improving the quality of the project is going to make them more money. That's effectively it. So coming back to stating your goals, just being really clear over the goal being for quality, and then coming back to, is a fork really a failure? Then you can just simply ask, well, did the fork yield more or less quality? And that can sort of, it still doesn't make it super simple, but it can certainly help. And I kind of wanted to talk about this concept of forkophobia that is pretty prevalent in the open source world. So it makes a lot of sense, right? Like, you spend a lot of time working on this project, and you are very enthusiastic about the project. Of course, you're going to want to continue to work on it and continue to be part of the community and maybe be seen as a leader within that community. But this concept of forkophobia can easily pull you away from the original goal, which is quality. Like, is the goal for you to be the leader of or maintainer of a project, or is it to have high quality software? And so if forking a project, guarantees that quality would be lower, then maybe forkophobia makes sense. But there's certainly a lot of cases where it really doesn't. And so in most cases, though, you probably want to avoid forks because it's going to fragment the community. You're going to basically spend less time and attention on individual problems, doubling up on effort. So there are some things that you can do to help to deter forks from happening. But of course, there's no silver bullets. So some of these things are, like, first and foremost, just an insane focus on quality. And so quality is like a very giant umbrella term, and everybody might have a different meaning to it for it. But typically, I like to think of quality as being a function of a couple things. Most notably, keeping the complexity of the project itself very low, and basically structuring the project so that as feature requests and new problems come around, you have a way of addressing those problems without increasing the complexity of the project. So, like, using plugins and extensions, or providing a way for users to create plugins and extensions for your project, that's a really great way to keep the base quality of the project really high and allow other outside contributors to still be part of the project and to still write code that can be impactful within your project. And a really, really big one is consistency in the processes. And when I say processes, I mean, like, how are code reviews done? If you have a change log, what does that look like? Does it include everything? When a commit comes in, how should it be structured? Will it be merged if it's not structured that way? Basically, anything that is in the process of an idea to a release should be considered, part of your process, and keeping those consistent is really important. A very big thing here too is the code itself certainly solves the problem, but the community surrounding the code is huge, and that's what's going to keep it going. And a typically good way of maintaining a good community is literally just to work really hard at it, and don't underestimate the amount of time it takes to do this. And, like, be very well aware that you're going to spend an unbelievable amount of time on this project, and if you aren't willing to do that, then it's probably not going to live for too long. And so when I say putting time into the project, I don't necessarily mean just writing features and fixing bugs and whatnot, but I more so mean taking the time to explain yourself very thoroughly. And when somebody comes and makes an issue, you can easily say, no, I don't like it, and have your reasons. But that's not going to foster a community, right? You're going to foster a community by explaining yourself. And that's also going to be there forever. So when somebody comes around later and they have a similar question or whatever, you're not going to have to repeat yourself all the time, and you can refer back to that time where you spent spent your day replying to this concern. And And the same goes with pull requests as well. Like, it's way easier to reject than approve a pull request, and it takes a lot of time to give good feedback on somebody's PR. Just going to try to roll through a little faster. A really big thing too is to hold your own contributions to the same standard that you expect others to contribute. So this basically means, like, if you have rules about, you know, how many approvals you need to merge, don't break the rules because you're the, you know, I'm the founder, or I'm the maintainer. Like, you really should try to treat everybody in this community as equals, and that way, you know, people will feel like they are actually part of the community. And slow isn't bad is a good one, because oftentimes there's a pressure to move quickly on somebody's decision or somebody's suggestions, or if somebody took time to make a pull request and implement a feature, there's this urge to, like, oh yeah, it's good, I want to get it in right now. But there's a lot of value in just slowing down and taking the time to collect internal opinions, but also trying to find people who aren't biased by the project to also comment on it, especially when the change is significant. A really big one too is to be humble, and I think this is very broad, but there's a lot of hostility in open source typically, and I think the more common tone to an issue is aggressiveness, usually, honestly. And maybe I think it's a lot to do with just frustration, because typically building software can be really frustrating, especially when you're using somebody else's code and it doesn't work like they say it does. But just understand that anyone using your project, anyone taking the time out of their day to write an issue about it is a gift to you. Like, they're donating their time and they don't have to do that. And remember, the goal is quality, right? And it doesn't matter what tone the person's taking. If they take time out of their day to write words to you, it can be wrapped into some way of improving quality. It's just a matter of perspective. And yeah, just like, you really need to have thick skin. I think that's kind of the root of it. And everyone's going to fail at this. Everyone's going to have slip-ups and bad days and whatever. And just, you know, everyone's human. So all you can do is be humble and, like, don't make assumptions about things if you can. And yeah, so getting more into the organizational structure of things to improve the longevity of an open source project. There's a lot of things you can do to set yourself up on the right foot. Most notably, very well outlining what the organizational structure is. And so that means saying, you know, this organizational structure is no organizational structure. That is an organizational structure, and just being clear about that is going to be really important for you know, setting the expectations with new entrants to the community. And yeah, so within a organization, you'll probably have people doing specific roles, and one thing that helps to build community is for people to see the potential roles and the impact that they could have, and then also have instructions for how they can be that person and do that thing. So, like, giving the role a name and describing in as much detail as possible the responsibilities of the person's role, and also the limitations of the permissions they have within the organization. I think really important parts to this is like defining, you know, who can merge changes, who can approve changes, but most importantly actually would be who can add new members, who can kick a member out, who can change the owner, or is there an owner? How do you become the owner? Like, laying these things out take a lot of time, but if you don't do them, it can really come and bite you later if the project grows very large. And take that with a grain of salt because you don't want to spend too much time up front on stuff that might be a waste of time. There's a lot of automations and tooling that can help you with some of this stuff. GitHub has added a lot of things recently. So like this is the member permissions page on GitHub for an organization. And you can see like there's a lot of really nice stuff that you can set up. And you can also just make this public on your repo. Like you can say, do this, take a screenshot, and put it in your README. So this is the permissions we have for OpenRPC right now. The theology is that we want to be very permissive of accepting new members into being a member of the GitHub organization. But we want the permissions that they have when in the organization to be minimal. And for those permissions to be added over time. So as a member of the organization, you can't really do much you can't really do anything that a non-member can't do other than be added to a team which does have permissions that are additional. A part of defining your project is certainly to be very clear over the goals of the project, and it can be stated as the problem or general theme, but also a statement of whether or not you accept changes to that goal itself, right? So if a project's goal is to build the fastest car in the world, is it okay if somebody comes around and says, well, what if we build the most comfy car in the world? Is that all right? I don't know. Some projects it is, some projects it isn't. One thing that often doesn't get talked about is the laws across the world are all different, and it's something you should probably consider when you're starting your project is maybe what you're doing isn't lawful in some places. And so if that's the case, you should probably state that before it becomes a very big problem. For organizational processes, general rule of thumb, automate them or they won't happen. And basically, if you can't automate a process, then just don't accept the process as part of your organization. Especially as you start working on more and more things, the amount of time that you'll have to putting into clicking the button the merge button, or say approve, release, or whatever. These kinds of things, they can take up a lot of time, and if you don't automate them, we go back to the consistency of processes. So if you want to have your processes be very consistent, automate them. And if they're not automated, they're probably not going to be consistent, and it's going to go very poorly for you. Not a lot of time, so I'll rip through, but use branch protection rules as part of GitHub so that people can't push to master, but also you can set up a bunch of pull request checks that can do stuff like linting, testing, generating docs, basically as much as you can do to make sure that the person hasn't broken anything. This is the GitHub UI for setting up branch protection rules. This one would be for master. You can say, all right, I need one reviewer, et cetera, et cetera. We use a tool in OpenRPC called semantic release. It automates much of this. You can pretty much just make a config file, tell it what plugins you want to use. It'll generate your change log, tell you what the next version of the release is. And a big part of that is that it makes the next version an unemotional decision, which is quite nice. And automate things like issue tracking and updating issues when things have been fixed. So that's something that semantic release does for us within OpenRPC. Here's an example of an issue that was opened, and then there was a commit that had fixes 240 or whatever, and then when that gets merged and released, the semantic release bot comes around and makes a comment saying, hey, your issue is resolved in 121. And that can be really nice for community engagement and keeping people happy and aware that you're paying attention to their stuff. It was hinted on earlier, but choose a license, and generally, like, if the focus is quality, then try to keep the project as far from politics as possible. Like, it's really easy to say, like, a good one's like GPL, being infectious, trying to promote more open source software. It's kind of like you're adding your political views to this software project. And if, again, the point is quality, how does that political view improve quality of your particular project? And if it doesn't, then don't do it. CLA, I don't want to talk too much about it, but like, I don't know if you've ever opened a PR and then it says, sign this CLA. It's like kind of a big kick in the teeth, especially when you're going back to this idea of like, any contribution is a gift, and somebody's spending their time to improve the code that you put, and maybe they don't want to spend very much time. Maybe they don't even want to be part of the community. They're just like, oh, this thing's broken, let me go fix it. And now they have to sign a CLA that probably just won't do it. I've been there. Anyway. So, as I said, starting a project on the right foot saves you a lot of time. That's why we created this project called Pristine. So Pristine aims to be a base repo that you can use as a template for your projects. It's composable, so Pristine itself, that repo assumes that it's not even really a code-based project. It mostly just has some templates for like contributing guidelines, some license stuff, and more or less slots to put stuff in. There's also a lot of GitHub-y stuff like issue templates, pull request templates. But as I said, it's composable, so we have, say, Pristine TypeScript, which is all the stuff from Pristine, and then plus all the stuff you would need to have a TypeScript project. So like Circle CI with the semantic release stuff all set up. And you can basically just use this template, change the name, add your code, and as you use GitHub regularly, it'll just do your releases for you. You just have to set up your tokens with Circle CI. And there's some other ones, like ones that set up some stuff with like AWS and Elastic Beanstalk. So if you guys are deploying an app and you want, won't get too much into that anyway. So if you've done all these steps, can your project still die? Yeah, obviously. But what is a dead project? It's pretty easy to, like, when you come across a project, most people will measure its activity by like the number of contributions, when the last release was. Maybe you look at the number of commits since the last release, open pull requests, how long they've been open for. And generally, if you have lots of open pull requests, lots of open issues, and nobody's touching them, that's a pretty good indication that the project's dead because nobody's maintaining it. And maybe there's like a project's ultimately dead, I suppose, when there are no more users actually using it. And over time in history, which albeit very short, software, like open source software, the oldest packages, probably like 30 years or something. That said, in a lot of projects, when the founding team or person or whoever or like core group of maintainers moves on, certainly some projects have had success in handing off, but it's a very difficult thing to do successfully. And you should also be very aware of the number of dependencies of your project, because if a dependent project dies and it's critical to your project, it could very well mean that your project will also die, especially if the amount of work to update it is very great. And so, yeah, some general takeaways. I think really the biggest one is just like work harder. Like if you want people to use your project, like give them a good reason to use it. Just document it well, communicate very clearly, and spend the time to make it good. And yeah, limit the scope, and because that'll help you not spend your whole life on it. I guess I should hint at the last point here, which is if you want a project to outlive yourself, then you should plan for yourself to no longer be part of that project. And so I use the, plan your own death. It's pretty dark, but really what I mean is plan for you to no longer work on that project anymore. like if you're not interested in it, it's not going to go well, and you're probably going to run it into the ground. So come up with a plan, and like I said earlier, like for each role, describe how somebody can become that role. Yeah, and that's it. Sorry I went over time. Maybe we'll take one question if possible. Two? Okay. Yeah.
Just make them good ones.
Yeah, I was thinking about the scope that you are talking about on the open source. What is a good limit for keeping the scope of your project limited? Because as you said, the more we grow the software, it becomes very specific and the usage might drop, right? So it will die. So is there any optimum scope that we should kind of limit to so that the project lives for a longer time rather than dies soon?
Well, so I kind of think like open source, like there's sort of two tiers of project in my view. There's tools and code to solve a problem, and there's specifications for like structured ways of approaching a problem. So like let's take the tooling side. A really good way to be very conscious of scope creep with a tooling project would be to, of course, state the problem that you're solving. So like it's a JSON, filter method or whatever. But then a nice way, and like probably seen it in a bunch of repos, like put a list of features, and it's like kind of painful because it's like, how do I create a bullet point list of the things that are features for this tool? But what it does is like when you add some more stuff, it makes you think, like, how am I going to go add this to the list? And then like, is that going to be a like cumbersome thing to be adding to that list? And it can just basically being aware of what you're about to add and how it changes the scope is like the first step in stopping scope from blowing up. And then I'd say for the spec style projects, over communicating the problem and like where it begins and ends for you, it will prevent that pretty well, I think. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, question from YouTube. Are there any open source communities beside ETC that are doing it the way you guys are doing, like document-driven development and all that,
Like cryptocurrency or like just open source?
Open source communities.
Yeah. I mean, there's lots of them. Like, Elasticsearch is probably one of my favorite open source projects because of this one idea that they have, which is what is considered a bug. So for them, any time somebody comes to any of their projects, any of their documentation, if there's something that they don't know how to do, or if there's something that's not explained there, or like if they're opening an issue being like with just getting the idea completely wrong, that's treated as like first-class bug to them. So like they really focus on documentation first because basically like if somebody's not getting it or they're using it wrong, you can be like, well, that person's an idiot, or you can solve the problem, right? So Elasticsearch is a great example. Say like TypeScript recently has done an incredible job of producing a lot of informational resources alongside. But yeah, I think those are good. Anyway, thank you guys.
Thank you.
Come on.